From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We are continuing the pressure because we want what happens next to be, power to the people and to be true democratic Egypt that represents all of its people. We should also remember that the initial slogans were not just topple the regime, but it were also عيش حرية كرامة عدالة اجتماعية, which is bread, freedom, social justice.
Alaa Abdel Fattah, one of Egypt's most prominent bloggers and activists, has been released from prison after nearly 2 months behind bars. His wife gave birth to their first child while he was in custody. We'll go to Cairo to speak with Alaa. Then acclaimed author Russell Banks on his new novel, Lost Memory of Skin, and his writing.
I know that as a kid, in a broken home that was marred by alcoholism and violence and so forth, storytelling was a way, just within the circle of the family, for me and my brothers and so on, and for myself to save ourselves. We could make sense of an otherwise incoherent life for children.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. North Korea is holding a 2-day state funeral for the late leader Kim Jong-il. His son and presumed successor, Kim Jong-un, led a military procession earlier today through the capital, Pyongyang. Iran is vowing to block a key passageway for the world's oil supplies if the U.S. proceeds with new economic sanctions. On Tuesday, a top Iranian official said Iran would close off the Strait of Hormuz if the U.S. fully implements a measure that would sanction Iran's oil exports, a major source of Iranian government revenue. About a fifth of the world's oil is said to pass through the strait. The sanctions were passed as part of a congressional measure targeting Iran for its alleged nuclear activities and now await President Obama's signature. Thousands of Syrians demonstrated in the flashpoint city of Homs on Wednesday amidst a visit by a team of observers with the Arab League. The observers are in Syria to assess the Syrian government's compliance with an Arab League plan to resolve Syria's political crisis, including the withdrawal of state forces and weapons from residential areas, the release of political prisoners, and the establishment of dialogue between the government and the opposition. Syrian activists say 70,000 people turned out for a march in the center of Homs, but were dispersed by government forces. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch says Syrian government forces have transferred hundreds of prisoners in Homs to military installations where the observers are barred. Activists also report at least 35 people were killed in nationwide violence Tuesday, 14 of them in Homs. In Egypt, the trial of former President Hosni Mubarak has resumed after a nearly 2-month delay. Mubarak's facing charges for allegedly ordering the killing of protesters during the uprising against his regime. We'll have more on Egypt after headlines. The White House has announced President Obama will ask lawmakers for a $1.2 trillion increase to the federal debt ceiling. It would mark the last increase under the bipartisan spending deal reached in August when the U.S. faced the prospect of a debt default. Democratic Senator Ben Nelson of Nebraska has announced he plans to retire instead of seeking re-election next year. Nelson served nearly 2 decades in Nebraska by fashioning himself as a centrist who maintained right-wing positions on a number of issues. His departure could threaten Democrats' Senate majority. Nelson is the only Democrat in Nebraska's 5-member congressional delegation. The White House has announced plans to nominate 2 former Treasury Department officials to the Federal Reserve. Jeremy Stein, a Democrat, is a Harvard professor who served on the White House National Economic Council and as an advisor to Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. Meanwhile, Jerome J. Powell, a Republican, is a former financial executive who worked under George H.W. Bush. He spent nearly a decade with the private equity firm the Carlyle Group and worked as a lawyer and investment banker on Wall Street. 2 Swedish journalists have been sentenced to an 11-year prison term in Ethiopia. Martin Schibbye and Johan Persson were arrested in July on charges of aiding a rebel group and entering the country illegally. In Stockholm, the pair's Swedish attorney, Thomas Olsson, criticized the verdict.
11 years in prison can, at the first glance, seem as a positive decision if you think of the fact that the prosecutor wanted 18.5 years. But you should always also remember that this is about two innocent journalists who have tried to do their work. And in that perspective, to sentence them to 11 years in prison is a very brutal verdict.
Cuba has released more than 2,500 prisoners under a New Year's amnesty announced last week. Cuba says it made the decision ahead of a visit from Pope Benedict scheduled for the spring. A Cuban human rights group says 5 of an estimated 66 political prisoners were among those released. And Argentina has announced President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner has cancer and will soon undergo an operation. A spokesperson says the cancer is confined to Kirchner's thyroid gland and has not metastasized. She'll step aside as president for 20 days while undergoing treatment next month. Fernández de Kirchner's husband, former President Nestor Kirchner, died of a heart attack last year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.